The hum of the primary array was a low, comforting thrum against the soles of my boots, a familiar rhythm in the quiet expanse of the fire lookout tower. Wind, thin and sharp, whispered around the reinforced glass panels that formed my panoramic sanctuary. Below me, the forest stretched to the horizon, a boundless tapestry of dark green, a single, uninterrupted sweep of ancient growth. And within it, something I hadn't yet deciphered. I leaned closer to the console, the cool metal a steady anchor for my forearms. The air here always carried a faint, sterile scent, a mix of ozone from the power converters and the dry, processed smell of circuit boards. It was a world away from the damp earth and pine resin that clung to the lower levels of the tower, a deliberate separation I maintained. Up here, my universe was lines of data, shimmering spectra, and the faint, filtered light of distant stars. This was my deep space observatory, a bespoke marvel I'd spent years assembling, meticulously calibrated to pierce the cosmic veil with unprecedented clarity. For weeks, I'd been mapping the Eridanus supervoid, a region of space so vast, so seemingly empty, it defied easy comprehension. A cosmic desert, a blank canvas in the grand tapestry. My current project was to run a series of ultra-sensitive scans, pushing the limits of the new generation array, simply to confirm the nothingness. It was a monotonous, yet crucial task. Just the expected quiet. Tonight was no different, or so I thought. My eyes swept across the main display, a vast scrolling waterfall of data points and spectral analyzers. The familiar dance of background radiation, the occasional flicker of a distant quasar, all within expected parameters. I reached for my mug, the ceramic warm against my palm, taking a slow sip of the cooling herbal tea. Then it happened. A single, jagged spike, a vertical slash of crimson against the deep indigo of the background noise. It appeared on the secondary frequency band, a band usually reserved for the most subtle, low-energy signals. My hand paused midair, the mug still at my lips. I blinked. It was gone. I dismissed it. A momentary glitch. A cosmic ray hitting a sensor, perhaps. The array was incredibly sensitive, sometimes too sensitive. I put the mug down, the gentle clink echoing slightly in the quiet. My fingers moved over the smooth, cool surface of the trackpad, bringing up the diagnostic logs. Everything reported nominal. No power fluctuations, no sensor errors, no software anomalies. Curiosity, a stubborn burr beneath my skin, nudged me. I rewound the data stream frame by frame, isolating the exact moment. There it was again. A fleeting, impossibly narrow spike. It lasted less than a tenth of a second, barely a blip. But it was there. And it wasn't random. The signature, however brief, carried a distinct, almost crystalline sharpness. Not the fuzzy, chaotic signature of cosmic noise. This felt deliberate. I frowned, leaning closer, my breath fogging the screen slightly. I ran a quick cross-correlation, comparing it against known astrophysical phenomena. Pulsars, magnetars, active galactic nuclei, even the faint echoes of primordial gravitational waves. Nothing matched. Not even close. It was too precise, too isolated. Just interference, Raj, I muttered to myself, the sound of my own voice a low rumble in the quiet space. My logical mind, trained by decades of rigorous scientific discipline, sought the simplest explanation. Equipment error. It had to be. Even with the best hardware, anomalies happened. But a persistent thread of unease began to unravel in my gut. There was no draft up here. I initiated a targeted scan, focusing the array's immense power back towards the exact coordinates from which the anomaly had originated. The Eridanus supervoid, the region where, according to every model, there was nothing. The array whirred, a deeper, more focused hum now as it reoriented. I watched the new data stream populate, a fresh canvas of indigo and green. Minutes stretched into a quiet eternity. My shoulders tensed. My eyes strained, scanning every line, every pixel. My fingers tapped an anxious rhythm on the console. Nothing, just the expected, featureless background. I let out a slow breath, a faint sigh of relief mingled with something else, a flicker of disappointment, perhaps. The rational part of me was pleased. No anomaly meant no phantom data, no wasted hours chasing a ghost. Then another spike. This one slightly longer, slightly more complex. A tiny, almost imperceptible tremor ran through my hands. It wasn't random. It carried a nuanced modulation, a subtle ripple within its brief burst. It was different from the first, not a repeat, but recognizably related. Like two distinct words spoken in the same unfamiliar language. My breath hitched. My heart gave a slow, deliberate thud against my ribs. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't noise. This was a signal. This defied every known principle, every accepted model of the universe. The Eridanus supervoid was a vacuum, a colossal emptiness. Nothing should be there, absolutely nothing. Yet here it was, not a continuous broadcast, not a steady beacon, but a series of distinct, non-repeating pulses. My fingers, now trembling slightly, moved with renewed urgency. I initiated a full spectral analysis, a deep dive into the properties of this impossible emission. The energy profile was bizarre, unlike anything I'd ever encountered. It wasn't thermal, wasn't synchrotron radiation, wasn't anything that could be explained by known physics. It was clean, too clean, like a perfectly pitched note from an instrument that shouldn't exist. I spent the next 2 hours in a feverish blur, cross-referencing, running algorithms, trying to find any mundane explanation. The only light was the glow of my screens, reflecting in my wide, unblinking eyes. With each test, each failed hypothesis, the impossible truth solidified. This was real, and it was utterly baffling. What was this? What kind of entity, what kind of phenomenon could exist in such a barren expanse, emitting signals that broke every rule? And why were they so deliberately non-repeating, like a conversation being held in a language I couldn't begin to parse? I logged the anomaly, detailing every parameter, every failed attempt at explanation, marking it for urgent review. Below me, the forest stretched to the horizon, a deep green tapestry broken only by the occasional glint of sunlight on a distant lake, and somewhere within it, an unspoken presence seemed to settle, a quiet observer to my solitary work. I leaned closer to the main console, the cool plastic of the keyboard, a familiar texture beneath my fingertips. The signal, the impossible anomaly, pulsed across the monitor in front of me. It wasn't a visual waveform, not a frequency graph, not anything I could easily categorize. It was more like a shimmering, intricate tapestry of numerical data, each digit a thread in a pattern that defied chaotic generation. For hours, I had been staring, my eyes burning, tracing the lines, searching for a flaw, a random spike, anything that would relegate it back to the realm of cosmic noise. But it remained stubbornly, unnervingly coherent. My initial analysis had been quick, almost dismissive. A glitch, a localized interference, perhaps a stray burst from a pulsar I hadn't properly accounted for. But the longer I looked, the more the data resisted easy explanation. It didn't conform to any known astrophysical phenomena. It wasn't the predictable chirp of a black hole merger, nor the staccato burst of a gamma-ray event. It held no discernible signature of electromagnetic radiation, no gravitational ripples, no neutrino flux. Yet it was something. A sustained emission, constant and unwavering, originating from the absolute void between galaxies, a region previously thought to be utterly barren. A tremor, subtle and internal, ran through me. I told myself it was fatigue, the caffeine wearing off, but I knew it was something else. I isolated a segment of the data, a seemingly arbitrary sequence of values. I ran it through every statistical test I possessed. Algorithms designed to ferret out patterns from the most convoluted noise. The results were immediate, stark. The signal was not random. My breath hitched. The screen glowed, indifferent to the sudden acceleration of my pulse. The statistical probability of such an ordered sequence occurring by chance, even over cosmic timescales, was effectively zero. It was like finding a perfect, crystalline fractal embedded in the chaotic splatter of a paint bomb. Too perfect, too designed. I leaned back, my chair groaning softly in the quiet. My hands were clammy. This wasn't just a pattern, it was a structure, a deliberate arrangement. But what kind of structure? It didn't repeat in a simple loop, nor did it follow any known mathematical progression I could identify. It shifted, evolved, each iteration building upon the last with an almost organic complexity. It felt like looking at a single, impossibly intricate word written in an alphabet no human mind had ever conceived. The thought, once unthinkable, solidified in my mind. This wasn't an anomaly, it was a communication. If this was a message, then who or what had sent it and from where? The coordinates pointed to nothing. Absolute vacuum. No stars, no planets, no nebulae. Just the vast, empty canvas between the cosmic structures. It defied every law of physics I knew. How could something transmit from nothing? What energy source could sustain such a thing? What medium carried it? It It wasn't light, it wasn't sound, it wasn't any force I understood. I spent the next 3 days in the fire lookout tower, a solitary vigil. The outside world ceased to exist. My phone, a forgotten weight in my pocket, vibrated occasionally, a distant, irrelevant buzzing. Calls from a colleague, the one who oversaw the array's maintenance, went unanswered. I ignored the automated alerts about my neglected administrative duties. My focus narrowed to a singular, desperate point, understanding the signal. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, my eyelids gritty, my vision blurring at the edges. But the signal, always the signal, kept me tethered to the console. I built new algorithms, custom designed to probe its unique characteristics. I tried to deconstruct it, find a Rosetta Stone within its impossibly dense patterns. The more I delved, the more profound the sense of an intelligence behind it grew. Not just intelligence, but something vastly, terrifyingly ancient. The sheer scale of its consistency, its unwavering presence across what must be billions of light years, suggested an entity that existed outside the fleeting timescales of stars and galaxies. It wasn't just old, it was elder. My head throbbed. I rubbed my temples, the rough skin of my palm abrading my forehead. The wind outside had picked up, howling a mournful tune around the glass. I felt profoundly alone, yet also intensely watched. It wasn't just patterns, it was language. I was sure of it now. But a language without discernible phonetics, without syntax I could grasp, without any referential framework. It was pure information, delivered in a form that seemed to bypass conventional senses, seeping directly into the analytical pathways of my mind. What kind of mind could craft such a message? And what precisely was it trying to say? Below me, the forest stretched to the horizon, a vast, undulating carpet of green and shadow, and for a moment I allowed myself the familiar solace of its expanse. Something in it, though, felt different tonight, a heavier quiet than usual. My eyes, however, were fixed on the data streams flowing across my monitors. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting light outside and the growing complexity of the signal I was charting. It was a labyrinthine weave of frequencies and modulations, utterly alien, yet undeniably structured. I had dismissed the initial flickering of my main display as a power fluctuation, a common enough occurrence in such an isolated setup. But then the secondary monitor, usually a solid, unwavering blue, pulsed with a momentary burst of static, a fleeting blizzard of gray and white that vanished as quickly as it appeared. I blinked, rubbing the bridge of my nose. Fatigue, I told myself, too many hours staring at screens. The next shift was more subtle. The low thrum of the array, usually a steady bass note, seemed to deepen, to take on a strange, almost guttural undertone. It was like listening to a familiar song played on an instrument slightly out of tune, a dissonance that grated on my nerves. I leaned closer to the console, straining my ears. Was it just the wind shifting around the tower, creating some odd acoustic effect? I pressed my palm against the cool metal casing of the server rack. The vibration was there, a low, resonant tremor that felt wrong. It wasn't the usual mechanical hum. It felt like something was resonating through the tower itself, not just within its machinery. My gaze drifted to the reinforced glass, out into the deepening twilight. The forest below seemed to hold its breath. For a fraction of a second I saw it, a ripple like heat haze distorting the distant pines, though the air in the tower was cool and still. It was gone before I could properly focus, a trick of the light perhaps, or a smudge on the glass I hadn't noticed. My breath hitched. My pulse quickened, a dull throb in my temples. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, scanning the horizon. Nothing. The signal itself was a torment, a constant, non-repeating sequence that defied all known compression algorithms, hinting at an information density that was simply terrifying. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, just a connection, a resonance. I delved into scanned academic papers, old ethnographic studies, anything that touched upon inexplicable phenomena or forgotten cosmic lore. It was in a digitized collection of obscure philosophical tracts, brittle and yellowed even in their virtual form, that I found the first unsettling mention. Symbols, described as impossible geometries found in remote ruins, said to be transcriptions of what these listeners perceived. One text, a faded account from an 18th century explorer, spoke of a remote mountain community driven to collective madness by the ceaseless, formless murmurs from beyond the familiar sky. Their madness, the explorer wrote, involved a compulsive urge to replicate these impossible geometries in their architecture and art. The images described in these texts, though vague, felt unsettlingly familiar, mirroring the intricate non-Euclidean complexity of the signal I was receiving. My fingers tightened on the mouse. The air in the tower felt suddenly heavy, pressing in on me. The low hum of the array shifted again, and this time I could swear I heard something else woven into it. A faint, almost imperceptible clicking sound, like countless tiny segments interlocking. It wasn't mechanical, it was too organic, too intricate. I swiveled my head trying to pinpoint its source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, an auditory illusion. But behind my reflection, in the deep blackness of the forest, I thought I saw a movement. Not a deer, not a bear. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, my chair scraping against the floor. The forest outside was still, utterly still, a solid wall of black. The hum of the array was gone. Only the frantic beat of my own blood filled my ears. What had I seen? Or more terrifyingly, what had seen me? The hum of the primary array, usually a low, comforting thrum against the soles of my boots, felt different now. It was a vibration that seemed to resonate not just through the fire lookout tower's steel structure, but through my own bones. Wind, thin and sharp, still whispered around the reinforced glass panels that formed my panoramic sanctuary, but the sound carried an edge it hadn't before, a metallic rasp. Below me, the forest stretched to the horizon, something in it. I kept staring at the dense canopy, searching for a distortion, a flicker, anything that would explain the prickle on my neck. My eyes burned, gritty from days spent hunched over monitors, chasing the impossible signal. It had been nearly a week since the last clear data burst, a week of fragmented echoes, whispers in the cosmic static that seemed to be getting louder inside my own skull. Was I just tired? Sleep, when it finally came, offered no escape. My dreams had become landscapes of impossible angles and colors that defied the spectrum. I was standing on a precipice, not of rock, but of something akin to solidified thought, its surface slick and gleaming. Above me, structures rose, vast and intricate, yet somehow fluid, shifting like oil on water. They weren't built, they simply were, a monumental architecture of non-existence. It was the feeling of being utterly insignificant, a speck of dust in the shadow of something that had never known light or warmth. A sound began, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through my chest, a note held for eons. It wasn't a sound I could replicate, more like the universe exhaling. My breath hitched. I tried to scream, but my throat was a stone. Then a presence, not seen but felt. A vastness that dwarfed the impossible structures, a slumbering awareness that stretched beyond the edges of the dream. It was ancient. It was hungry. The air in the lookout tower was still and cool, tasting faintly of ozone and old metal. My hands trembled as I pushed myself upright, the thin blanket tangling around my legs. The dream's impossible geometries lingered at the edge of my vision. A phantom afterimage. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, trying to banish the sensation of that colossal presence, that suffocating scale. The digital clock on my console glowed a sterile green, 03:17 a.m. I had only slept for 2 hours. Had the signal finally started to break through my defenses, or was this just the price of prolonged isolation and relentless obsession? I stumbled to the small kitchenette, pouring myself a glass of water, my fingers fumbling with the tap. The water tasted flat, metallic. I dropped the glass, the sound of shattering ceramic echoing sharply in the quiet tower. I stared at the shards on the floor, then back at the window. My reflection was normal again, albeit startled. The glass had simply slipped. That's all it was. How much more of this could I take before I truly started to lose my grip? The next day blurred into a haze of caffeine and desperate recalibration. I double-checked every sensor, every cable, every line of code. Nothing. The equipment was pristine. The signal remained, a persistent, rhythmic pulse, maddeningly consistent, yet utterly devoid of any coherent data I could process. It was like listening to a language spoken by a mountain range. The trees swayed in a gentle breeze, their needles a uniform, deep green. But then, for just a moment, a flicker. A section of the canopy, perhaps a mile out, seemed to shift. Not with the wind, but as if the very fabric of the landscape had folded in on itself, a brief, impossible tessellation of bark and leaves. My eyes snapped open wide. I blinked, rubbed them, then stared again. The forest was normal, green, unmoving save for the breeze. My heart thudded against my ribs, a dull, heavy drum. It had to be a trick of the light, fatigue playing havoc with my perception. What else could it be? Later, as twilight bled into the vast, star-dusted night, the air in the tower grew heavy. I felt it, a pressure against my eardrums, a subtle ringing that intensified the longer I looked at the distant, shimmering data plots of the signal. My skin crawled. I pushed away from the console, needing to move to break the growing claustrophobia. I paced the circular room, my boots scuffing softly on the metal floor. Each step felt heavier than the last. The panoramic view, usually a source of peace, now felt like 1,000 eyes staring in. Treeline was a jagged silhouette against the faint glow of the distant horizon. And then I saw it again. Not a flicker, not a ripple, but a definite, undeniable line in the air, stretching vertically from the forest floor, up past the tallest pines, and into the Inkai sky. It was thin, almost invisible, like a seam in reality itself. It pulsed faintly, a barely perceptible shimmer that seemed to be drawing the light into itself. My vision narrowed. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. It was too real to be a trick of light, too precise to be fatigue. What impossible geometry was unfolding before my very eyes? The line grew stronger, a faint, iridescent glow now tracing its impossible path. It wasn't a laser, wasn't a reflection. It was a tear in the air itself, a boundary where two realities met and chafed. I could hear a low, internal hum, not from the array, but from deep within my own head. A frequency that felt wrong, invasive. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside me, resonating with every bone. My stomach churned. A wave of nausea washed over me, hot and dizzying. I staggered back, bumping into the console, sending a cascade of small equipment rattling to the floor. My eyes were fixed on the line, which now seemed to be slowly, imperceptibly widening. I could feel its gaze, not on me, but through me, as if I were merely a translucent veil. My legs felt like jelly. I dropped to my knees, trembling, the cold metal of the floor seeping into my jeans. My mind screamed for logic, for reason, for an explanation that wasn't a descent into madness. But there was none. Only the widening crack and the suffocating pressure of something utterly alien. What would happen when the seam finally split open? Wind, thin and sharp, still whispered around the reinforced glass, but I barely registered its cold touch. My focus was absolute, fixated on the monitors displaying the signal's increasingly complex patterns. They danced, shifted, and reformed with a terrifying grace, each pulse a whisper of something ancient and vast. My colleagues, I knew, wouldn't understand. They would look at the data, the impossible origin, the sheer defiance of known physics, and dismiss it. I had tried, of course. My first attempts to share my findings were cautious, measured, wrapped in scientific jargon that I hoped would lend them credibility. I attached the raw data, the spectral analyses, the spatial coordinates that placed its origin beyond any known celestial body. The initial responses were polite, if a little bewildered. Intriguing, one email from a senior researcher read, but perhaps an instrument malfunction or an unforeseen atmospheric interference. Another, from a colleague I respected, suggested I recalibrate my equipment. I dismissed their concerns, too engrossed in the signal's unfolding complexity. It was like trying to explain a symphony to someone who had only ever heard static. My determination, though, began to fray at the edges of my sanity. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, or perhaps one the signal wouldn't allow. My hands, when I finally forced myself to send a video call to the lead astrophysicist, trembled slightly, betraying the frantic energy thrumming beneath my skin. "Raj," the lead astrophysicist said, his face appearing on the screen, creased with a concern I initially mistook for scientific curiosity. "You look tired. Are you taking breaks?" I laughed, a short, sharp sound that felt alien even to my own ears. "Tired? I'm on the cusp of the greatest discovery in human history. It's not an anomaly, not interference. It's communicating." My voice had risen, the words tumbling out, too fast, too fervent. I gestured wildly at the screens behind me, my eyes wide, probably bloodshot. I could see the lead astrophysicist's gaze flick from my face to the impossible data, then back to my face, a subtle shift in his expression. It wasn't awe, it was something akin to pity. "Raj," he repeated, his voice softer, slower, "I think you need to step away from the primary array. Take a few days, clear your head." Clear my head. I almost shouted, my grip tight as I gripped the edge of my desk. "Do you hear yourself?" This isn't a headache. This is everything. It's alive. It's from beyond." The video call ended abruptly. He didn't hang up. It simply disconnected. I tried calling back, but my calls went straight to voicemail. The scientific community, once my sanctuary, had effectively closed its doors. I was an eccentric, a crackpot, a man succumbing to the isolation of the fire lookout tower. Forest stretches to horizon, something in it. But I wasn't wrong. I couldn't be. My isolation intensified my resolve. If they wouldn't listen to my data, perhaps I needed a different language, a different framework to understand what I was encountering. I turned away from the polished screens and peer-reviewed journals. I started digging into the forgotten corners of academic databases, obscure digital archives, and even physical texts that had long been relegated to dusty, climate-controlled sub-basements. Days bled into nights. The air in my small living quarters grew thick with the smell of old paper and lukewarm coffee. My fingers, stained with printer ink, scrolled through crumbling digital scans of texts translated from dead languages. My eyes, perpetually burning, devoured accounts of things that existed before existence, of entities that slumbered in the unformed chaos. Then, I found it, hidden within a digitized collection of 18th-century occult manuscripts, tucked between alchemical diagrams and astrological predictions, was a series of abstract carvings and cryptic verses. The language was flowery, metaphorical, but the core imagery resonated with an unsettling precision. It described a vast, incomprehensible intelligence, not born of stars or galaxies, but of the very fabric of nothingness itself. It spoke of its song as a thing that unmade minds and rewrote the very essence of seeing. My breath hitched. The description of its song, the signal, sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold air. The text continued, detailing how those who truly perceived this presence were either consumed by madness or granted a terrible, forbidden clarity, seeing the world not as it was, but as a fragile illusion draped over an unthinkable truth. I stared at the archaic script, then at the glowing patterns on my monitors. This wasn't some ancient, superstitious fear. This was a record, a warning, passed down through generations by those who had somehow impossibly glimpsed the same cosmic horror I was now charting. My hands trembled again, but this time not from fatigue, but from a burgeoning, terrible understanding. What other secrets did these forgotten texts hold, and what price would I pay for unearthing them? My breath hitched. The text continued, detailing how those who truly perceived this presence were either consumed by madness or granted a terrible, forbidden clarity, seeing the world not as a solid, knowable place, but as a flimsy veil draped over something ancient and utterly hostile. I let the tablet clatter onto the metal desk, the sound sharp in the quiet of the fire lookout tower. The air was thin up here, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth from the forest stretches to horizon, something in it. I could feel the wind pressing against the glass panes, a low moan that seemed to echo the unsettling words I'd just read. Madness or clarity, I felt like I was already teetering on the edge of both. My fingers, surprisingly steady, reached for the keyboard. I had to know. I had to see what this clarity truly entailed. Days blurred into a haze of caffeine and flickering screens. The solitude of the tower, once a comfort, now felt like a cage, or perhaps a pedestal for observation. I had programmed a new set of algorithms, born from a feverish intuition rather than logical deduction. It wasn't about breaking a code, it was about finding a resonance, a way for my own mind to interface with the raw, conceptual data embedded within the signal. I fed the vast, chaotic stream of static and pattern into the system, my gaze fixed on the main monitor. The signal was a language without grammar, a narrative without words. It wasn't a sequence of symbols to be translated, but a direct download of pure understanding. My algorithms, more like filters than deciphers, began to isolate recurring patterns, not as sound waves or light frequencies, but as ideas. It was like trying to catch mist in a sieve, yet somehow, my mind was beginning to grasp at the ephemeral substance. The first breakthrough came not with a flash of insight, but with a creeping sense of profound wrongness. The screen, usually filled with oscillating waveforms, shimmered, not a visual effect, but a distortion that seemed to pull at my own perception. My head ached, a deep throb behind my eyes, as if my brain was physically restructuring itself to accommodate something alien. The first concept hit me like a cold wave: scale. not the scale of galaxies, which I understood intellectually, but the true, crushing scale of existence. I saw, or rather, felt, the universe as an infinitesimal speck within something unimaginably larger, something that dwarfed even the concept of a cosmos. Our universe, a transient bubble of energy and matter, was less than a dust mote's shadow in an expanse that defied dimension. I felt small, smaller than small, irrelevant. My hands trembled as I typed, adjusting parameters, chasing the thread of this horrifying understanding. The air in the tower grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure. The scent of ozone, usually faint, sharpened, stinging my nostrils. I could hear the rhythmic hum of the servers, a monotonous drone that was slowly becoming indistinguishable from the ringing in my ears. Then came the second download. Time, not the linear progression we knew, but a vast, cyclical churning, where epochs rose and fell like tides in an endless ocean. Our entire history, from the first protozoa to the last dying star, was less than a single breath in this eternal cycle. And in that breath, countless other universes, other realities, had flickered into being and vanished, utterly unremarked. It wasn't just that we were insignificant, it was that our very concept of significance was a child's game played in a fleeting moment of cosmic unawareness. My skin felt clammy, despite the relative warmth of the tower. I wanted to stop. My fingers hovered over the abort command, but a strange compulsion, a terrible hunger for this forbidden knowledge, kept me rooted. My eyes were glued to the screen, where now, instead of patterns, I saw fleeting, abstract impressions, shapes that weren't shapes, colors that defied the spectrum. The third concept arrived, and with it, a wave of nausea. Life, my understanding of it shattered. What we called life, consciousness, sentience, was merely a minuscule, incidental byproduct. There were other forms of existence, deeper, vaster, more fundamental, entities that were not born, did not die, did not live in any way comprehensible to a biological organism. They simply were. They had no needs, no desires, no awareness of our fleeting existence. We were less than bacteria to them, less than the vibrations in the very dust of their non-being. My stomach lurched. I gagged, tasting bile in my throat. The room spun. I gripped the edge of the desk, my grip tight. The forest stretches to horizon. Something in it outside the window seemed to ripple, the green canopy momentarily dissolving into a chaotic blur of non-colors, non-forms. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to banish the images, the concepts that were burning themselves into the core of my mind. When I opened them again, the forest was back, solid and green, but it felt wrong, like a stage prop. The air was still thick, the ozone smell overpowering. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I felt like I was being stretched, pulled apart, my very essence unraveling. The screen pulsed, inviting me further. There was more, so much more. Would I be consumed by madness, or granted a clarity so terrible it would shatter everything I was, seeing the world not as it was presented, but as it truly existed beneath the thin veneer of perceived reality? My breath hitched. The text continued, detailing how those who truly perceived this presence were either consumed by madness or granted a terrible, forbidden clarity, seeing the world not as a fixed stage, but as a fragile membrane stretched taut over an abyss. I finished the paragraph, then the page, then the entire crumbling manuscript. The final words seemed to dissolve into the air, leaving behind not understanding, but a profound, aching emptiness. It wasn't the kind of emptiness that comes from lack of information, but from an overwhelming presence of something too vast to contain. My fingers, stained with the ancient dust from the pages, felt alien to me, distant. The clock on my desk glowed 3:47 a.m. Again, sleep had become a myth, a forgotten ritual from a life I barely recognized. The last few weeks had blurred into an endless gray continuum of data streams, signal analysis, and now, these cryptic writings. My body ached with a fatigue that no amount of rest could assuage. When I did manage to drift off, the dreams were not dreams at all, but echoes of the signal, vast and cold, filling the void behind my eyes with impossible geometries and a silence that screamed. I would wake in a sweat, my heart thrumming, the phantom vibration of the song still resonant in my bones. My skin was pallid, almost translucent, and a faint tremor ran through my hands. The man staring back at me was not Raj, the astrophysicist, but a vessel scoured clean by an unseen force. What was left was an unnerving quietude, a profound detachment. The urgent emails from my colleague about funding deadlines, the worried phone calls from a distant relative, even the rumbling of my own stomach, they all registered as distant echoes, meaningless background noise. My world had shrunk to the signal, the manuscript, and the terrifying chasm of what lay beyond. The shift in my perception began subtly, a flicker at the edge of my vision, like a faulty light bulb, but always in my peripheral, never quite there when I turned my head. The hum of the servers, usually a steady drone, sometimes seemed to waver, dipping into frequencies that made my teeth ache, then returning to normal before I could pinpoint the change. I'd blink, rub my eyes, convinced it was exhaustion, a trick of the light, a symptom of the sleep deprivation gnawing at my brain, but it persisted. One afternoon, standing by the window of my office, gazing out at the city below, I saw it more clearly. The distant skyscrapers, usually rigid lines of glass and steel, seemed to breathe, not sway with the wind, but subtly undulate, their edges blurring and sharpening as if viewed through heat haze, yet the air was perfectly still. I stared harder, focusing on a particular building. Willing it to happen again, nothing. The city sat solid and unyielding under the pale sun. Had I finally crossed the threshold? There was this the madness the manuscript warned of. I started taking long drives, escaping the sterile confines of my office and apartment. The open road, the vastness of the sky, I sought a sense of normalcy, a solid anchor, but even the world outside felt different. Colors seemed duller or sometimes strangely vibrant, almost artificial. One crisp autumn morning, I found myself driving aimlessly through winding rural roads, the car rattling over gravel. The trees on either side of the road, heavy with fading gold and crimson leaves, seemed to press in on me, their branches like skeletal fingers. I drove until the road ended, giving way to a narrow, overgrown track. The track climbed steadily, and I followed it, a strange compulsion guiding my hands on the wheel. Finally, the track opened onto a small clearing, dominated by a towering structure. It was a fire lookout tower, forest stretches to horizon, something in it. The wooden structure, aged and weathered, stood sentinel over an endless sea of trees, their canopies rippling in the unseen wind. I parked the car, feeling an odd sense of inevitability. I needed to climb it. I needed to see. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step a protest against my ascent. The wood felt rough, almost alive beneath my palms as I gripped the railing. When I finally reached the small cabin at the top, I pushed open the heavy door. I walked to the panoramic window, my gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of forest. Miles and miles of trees, a patchwork of greens, golds, and browns stretching to the distant, hazy horizon. It was a beautiful, humbling sight. And then I saw it. It wasn't a flicker or a shimmer this time. It was a fundamental distortion. A section of the forest, perhaps a square mile of pines several miles away, seemed to bend. The trees, usually vertical, were subtly warped, leaning inward towards a central, invisible point, as if caught in an impassable gravitational pull. Their branches, instead of reaching upwards, were drawn into a vortex, a silent, swirling more of green and brown. It was not a trick of light, not exhaustion, not madness. It was real. It was there. My hands pressed against the cold glass, gripped tight. The world wasn't just subtly wrong. It was fundamentally broken in places, and I was seeing it. This was the terrible clarity the manuscript spoke of, a window into the true, grotesque architecture of reality. What else was bending, twisting, just beyond my newly opened sight? What other horrors lay hidden in plain view, masked by the comforting lie of normalcy? Detailing how those who truly perceived its nature, those who listened beyond the static, found themselves irrevocably changed, not just in mind, but in a way that twisted the very fibers of their being, aligning them with its incomprehensible rhythm. My fingers, cold and stiff, gripped the tablet tighter. The song, the signal, it wasn't just data, it was an invitation. A tremor started in my hands, a subtle vibration that spread up my arms and settled in my chest. The air in my isolated lab, usually a comforting chill, now felt like a shroud. I reread the passage, my eyes tracing the lines, searching for a flaw, a metaphor I had missed. But the words were stark, direct. The presence wasn't merely broadcasting, it was calling. Its intricate, non-repeating patterns, which I had painstakingly catalogued for months, weren't random noise. They were an address, a plea, a command. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. All this time, I had approached it as an object of study, a phenomenon to be dissected with mathematical precision. But it was looking back, It was reaching out. The hair on my arms stood on end. My mind raced, trying to reconcile this new understanding with everything I thought I knew. If it was a call, then what did it want? What did it expect? The previous chapters of the cryptic text had hinted at a profound, terrifying shift in perception, a stripping away of the familiar. It spoke of a truth that would shatter the fragile construct of human reality. And now I understood that the signal wasn't just revealing that truth, it was guiding me to it. The colors, once abstract representations, now seemed to pulse with an intentionality, a slow, deliberate breath. I felt a pull, a subtle magnetic force drawing my attention, not to the data, but into it. My head began to ache, a dull throb behind my eyes that resonated with the low hum of the servers. Sleep became a distant memory. Food tasted like ash. My world narrowed to the signal, the text, and the gnawing certainty that I had to respond. The logical part of my brain screamed for caution, for peer review, for a second opinion. But the deeper, more primal part, the part that had been slowly unwound by the signal's persistent drone, knew that I was already too far gone. There was no turning back. The call had been heard. I needed to amplify the connection, not just the equipment's sensitivity, but my own. I needed to bridge the gap, to open myself entirely to its influence. I spent days in a feverish blur, sifting through arcane theories, cross-referencing forgotten papers on sensory deprivation and psychoacoustics. My colleagues, when they saw me, usually just offered a wide berth. Their expressions a mixture of concern and a vague unease. One, a quiet fellow who worked in the neighboring lab, once tried to suggest I take a break. I merely stared at him, my eyes probably reflecting the frantic energy that now consumed me, and he quickly retreated. My method, when it finally coalesced in my mind, was dangerously simple. It involved a custom-built array of transducers, designed not to receive the signal, but to re-emit it at specific, calculated frequencies directly into my own sensory organs. A feedback loop, in essence, designed to resonate with the signal's core pattern to make my very being a conduit. I would wear a specialized helmet, equipped with bone conduction speakers and optic nerve stimulators, bypassing the usual pathways of perception. I would become the antenna. The setup was crude, almost primitive in its execution, but the underlying principle was terrifyingly elegant. If the signal was a key, I was fashioning a lock in my own skull. The risk was immense, I knew it. Complete mental dissolution, irreversible neurological damage, a permanent descent into a reality unhinged from consensus. But the alternative, to ignore the call, to turn away from this profound, terrible truth, was no longer an option. I sought true isolation for the experiment, not just the lab, but somewhere utterly removed. I drove for hours, the old pickup truck rattling over increasingly rough roads, until I reached a place I knew from my youth, a place of profound quiet. A fire lookout tower, forest stretches to horizon, something in it. It stood on a rocky outcrop, weathered wood groaning faintly in the wind, its narrow stairs winding up into the vast, open sky. The air here was thin, sharp with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Climbing the stairs, each creak of wood beneath my boots sounded unnaturally loud. But it wasn't just the trees. There was something in it, a subtle ripple in the otherwise placid expanse, a sense of immense, watchful stillness that prickled the hairs on my neck. It felt less like a natural landscape and more like a vast, breathing entity itself, holding its breath. Inside the cramped observation room at the top, the panoramic windows offered an unobstructed view of the world, or what I thought was the world. I set up my equipment, the custom helmet, the small modified signal generator, the portable power supply. My hands trembled as I connected the last wire, the thin cable snaking from the generator to the helmet. I took a deep, shuddering breath. This was it, the moment of truth or madness. I placed the helmet on my head, the cold metal pressing against my temples, the pads settling over my eyes and ears. I felt a profound sense of claustrophobia, despite the open expanse just beyond the glass. With a final, desperate resolve, I activated the generator. A low thrum vibrated through my bones, starting in my jaw and spreading through my entire skull. Then came the sound, not through my ears, but within my head, a deep, resonant tone that felt like the earth itself was groaning. The pressure in my head intensified, a crushing weight that threatened to split my skull. Then the patterns began to coalesce. not into images, but into meaning. A vastness unfolded, a sense of scale that dwarfed anything I had ever conceived. I was no longer in the fire lookout tower. I was everywhere and nowhere. The forest below, the sky above, they dissolved into the same incomprehensible tapestry. And in that tapestry, I felt the presence not as a distant signal, but as a vast, immeasurable being stirring. It was no longer a call. It was a response. What had I truly woken? My fingers, cold and stiff, gripped the tablet. The words on the screen, detailing how those who truly perceived its nature, those who listened beyond the static, found themselves irrevocably changed, not just in mind, but in a way that twisted the very fibers of their being, aligning them with its incomprehensible rhythm, had etched themselves into my thoughts. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air seeping through the gaps in the old structure. I was in the fire lookout tower, forest stretches to horizon, something in it. The wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden slats, a mournful, constant sound that had once been calming. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a familiar comfort that now felt like a fragile veil. My breath hitched, a sudden, sharp intake of cold air. I placed the tablet carefully on the small, scarred table, its screen casting a dim, blue glow across my trembling hands. My makeshift equipment, a tangle of wires and repurposed sensors, sat humming softly nearby, connected to a laptop whose display flickered with the familiar, mesmerizing patterns of the signal. I had amplified the reception, pushing the delicate instruments beyond their intended limits, chasing the faintest resonance, the subtlest shift. I needed to know. I leaned closer to the laptop, my eyes tracing the undulating waveforms. They were more complex now, richer, like a symphony played on instruments I couldn't even begin to imagine. It wasn't just data anymore. It felt like a living language, flowing directly into my perception. A low thrum began deep within my chest, a vibration that wasn't sound, but a physical response to the signal's intensified presence. My vision blurred slightly at the edges, the rigid lines of the tower's interior seeming to soften, to breathe. The forest outside, previously a static backdrop, began to assert itself. It wasn't moving, not in any conventional sense, but I felt a profound shift in its essence. The something in it that I'd vaguely sensed before now felt more defined, like a colossal, slumbering weight just beneath the surface of my awareness. The pine scent intensified, almost cloying, and I tasted a metallic tang on my tongue. Like old blood and ozone, my skin prickled as if countless tiny insects were crawling over me, though I saw nothing. I closed my eyes, trying to recenter myself, but the effect only intensified. The thrum in my chest spread, vibrating through my bones, resonating in my teeth. It was as if my entire body had become an antenna, tuned to an impossibly deep frequency. And then it wasn't just a frequency. It was a presence. It wasn't a shape I could trace with my eyes, or a sound I could pinpoint with my ears. It was a comprehension that pressed in from every direction, dissolving the boundaries of the small room, of the tower, of the very atmosphere. This was its form. Not flesh, not energy, not even a concept I could label. It was an intelligence, an ancient, patient awareness that transcended form itself, manifesting as the complete restructuring of my internal landscape. My thoughts, once my own, felt like faint echoes in a cavernous space, observed and understood without effort by something immeasurably larger. It was like looking into a mirror, only to find the reflection was not mine, but the universe itself, contemplating its own infinite, indifferent complexity. Then came the understanding, clear and horrifying, not in words, but in an instantaneous, crushing download of pure alien intent. It wasn't malice, not anger. It was an indifferent, slow unfolding. Like a flower blooming across epochs, its petals rearranging the universe with each unfurl. Its existence was a process, a fundamental reordering. Our reality, the one I had taken for granted, was just a temporary configuration, a fleeting pattern it was destined to smooth away. My stomach churned, a knot of pure nausea tightening in my gut. Humanity wasn't an obstacle. We weren't even an inconvenience. We were the ephemeral dust motes dancing in the light of an incomprehensible dawn, soon to be swept clean. Our civilizations, our aspirations, our entire history were less than a blink in its eternal slow-motion transformation. My mouth went dry, tasting of ash. My legs felt weak, threatening to buckle beneath me. I gripped the edge of the table, my grip tight. The thrumming in my chest intensified, threatening to tear me apart from the inside. The air in the tower felt thin, suddenly devoid of oxygen, and I gasped, a ragged, desperate sound. Every cell in my body screamed in protest, in defiance of this crushing, undeniable truth. The forest outside, stretching to the horizon, now seemed like a mere ripple on the surface of something infinitely deeper, something that pulsed with an ancient, patient intent. What did one do when faced with the knowledge that one's entire existence, and that of one's species, was merely an accidental, insignificant detail in a cosmic design that was slowly, inevitably reshaping everything? The words on the screen, detailing how those who truly perceived its nature, those who listened beyond the static, found themselves irrevocably changed, not just in mind, but in a way that twisted the very fibers of their being, aligning them with its incomprehensible will. I felt a tremor run through me, not of fear, but of recognition. A cold, hard certainty settled in my gut. I was already one of them. The clarity, once a gift, had become a curse, an unwelcome passenger in my own skull. The city had become a cacophony of unwanted perceptions. Every face I saw on the street seemed to carry a faint echo of the signal's resonance, a subtle shift in their eyes, a tension in their jaw that wasn't quite human stress. I couldn't stand the noise, the sheer density of it, so I fled. The climb to the fire lookout tower was a blur of aching muscles and shallow breaths. The wooden steps groaned beneath my weight, a rhythm of decay that seemed to mark my hurried ascent. I hadn't slept properly in days, the signal now a constant hum beneath my thoughts, a low thrumming that vibrated in my teeth. Up here, perched above the world, I thought I might find some respite. I was wrong. From the tower's enclosed cabin, the world stretched out in a panorama of green and muted earth. The forest stretched to the horizon, an unbroken canopy of pine and fir, swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. But the air inside the cabin was still, heavy, almost viscous. My skin prickled. The sky above me was the first thing that truly disturbed me. It wasn't just gray or overcast. The clouds were bruised, a patchwork of sickly purples and greens that bled into one another, not like storm clouds, but like something festering. They hung low, too low, their undersides almost luminous with an unnatural glow. It felt less like looking at weather and more like peering into a vast, infected wound. My eyes ached from trying to make sense of the shifting hues, the way the light refused to conform to any known spectrum. Was this what the others had seen? I pulled out my tablet, its screen a dull glow in the strange light. News feeds, once dismissed as background noise, now held a terrifying significance. Reports of widespread insomnia, of mass hysteria in crowded places, of inexplicable communal trances in small towns. There were stories of people simply walking away from their lives, drawn by some unseen compulsion into the wilderness or towards the sea. The language was cautious, clinical, but beneath the measured words, I could feel the writer's own fear, a thin veneer of professionalism barely concealing the growing panic. It was leaking out. My gaze drifted back to the forest. The sheer expanse of it was daunting, an ocean of trees. And within that ocean, something was wrong. It wasn't moving, not exactly, but there was a subtle distortion, a ripple in the fabric of the landscape itself. Patches of trees, distant enough to blur, seemed to waver, as if seen through rising heat, but the air was cool up here. The green of the needles in those specific areas seemed to deepen, almost to black, then lighten again, a slow, rhythmic pulse that defied optical physics. It was like watching a breath, a slow, vast exhalation from the very earth itself. A low thrum began in my ears, a counterpoint to the distant, unnatural pulse of the forest. It wasn't a sound from outside. It was inside me, resonating with the very core of my being. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, pressing against my eardrums. My eyes darted around, searching for the source, but there was nothing, just the familiar wooden walls, the grimy window panes. Yet the feeling intensified, a pressure building behind my eyes, a sense of immense, unseen weight. It was in the air I breathed, in the strange light that filtered through the bruised clouds, in the unsettling pulse of the distant trees. I was a vessel, a receiver, and the world was beginning to tune into the same terrifying frequency. What would happen when everyone heard it as clearly as I did? The words on the screen, detailing how those who truly perceived its nature, those who listened beyond the static, found themselves irrevocably changed, not just in mind, but in a way that twisted the very fibers of their being, aligning them with its influence. The tablet slipped from my grasp, clattering against the floorboards of the old structure. I didn't even flinch. My gaze was already fixed on the window, on the world outside, no longer a familiar comfort, but a canvas waiting for a monstrous revision. I had driven for hours, the old pickup truck rattling over increasingly rough tracks, the engine groaning in protest. The impulse had been primal, an urge to climb, to gain altitude, to see, to witness. The fire lookout tower, forest stretches to horizon, something in it. It was the only place that made sense. A solitary sentinel, high above the world, offering an unobstructed view of the impending dawn, or perhaps the impending dissolution. The air in the tower's cramped cabin tasted of old wood and dust, a scent of forgotten vigilance. Below me, the vast expanse of green canopy stretched, an undulating sea of pines and firs. From this height, the individual trees blurred into a single dark texture, an unbroken blanket reaching for the horizon. It should have been a calming sight, the natural world in its stoic majesty. The first distortion wasn't a sudden, jarring rupture, but a subtle shift in the light. The greens of the forest canopy began to subtly, almost imperceptibly, bleed into hues I couldn't name. My eyes ached, trying to reconcile what they saw with what they knew. A low thrum vibrated through the floorboards, a resonance that was felt more than heard. It wasn't the wind, nor the tower settling. It was deeper, more fundamental, as if the very ground beneath the forest was singing a note too profound for human understanding. I pressed my palms against the cool metal of the railing, needing the solid contact, needing something to anchor me. My skin crawled. Then the trees. The collective canopy, once a uniform texture, began to ripple, not like wind, not like water, but with an internal motion. Individual trees, hundreds of feet below, seemed to twist and contort, their branches reaching not towards the sun, but towards each other, intertwining in impassable geometries. A cluster of pines on a distant ridge appeared to fold inward, their tips merging into a single, gnarled point, then expanding outward again, like a slow-motion, silent exhalation. The scale of it was staggering, miles of forest, breathing. My throat was dry. I swallowed hard, the sound loud in the sudden, eerie quiet. The familiar chirping of birds, the rustle of unseen creatures, all had fallen silent. Only that deep thrum remained, a constant companion to the visual horror unfolding before me. My vision blurred at the edges, my pupils dilating, struggling to process the impossible. I rubbed my temples, convinced it was fatigue, a trick of the light, anything but the truth. But the truth persisted. The horizon itself seemed to waver, a mirage in solid air. Distant mountains, once sharp and defined, now shimmered with an unsettling fluidity, their peaks bending and reforming in impossible angles. It was as if the very laws of perspective were being rewritten, distance and scale becoming arbitrary suggestions rather than fixed constants. My head spun. I stumbled back from the window, grabbing a rickety chair and collapsing into it, my breath catching in ragged gasps. This wasn't a signal anymore. This was a presence. It wasn't just influencing minds, it was reshaping the physical world. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken weight, pressing against my eardrums. Looking back out, I saw it. It wasn't a light source, but an absence of light that glowed, a negative space that defied comprehension. It expanded and contracted, a silent cosmic heart beating within the familiar green. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This wasn't a metaphor, this was real, and it was only just beginning. The words on the screen detailing how those who truly perceived its nature, those who listened beyond the static, found themselves irrevocably changed, not just in mind, but in a way that twisted the very fibers of their being, aligning them with its incomprehensible identity. A shiver, not of cold, but of something far deeper, crawled up my spine. My skin felt thin, like a membrane stretched taut over something that was no longer entirely me. I dropped the tablet onto the desk. I looked at my hands, flexing the fingers. They were still my hands, calloused from years of handling equipment, but a faint tremor ran through them. An unfamiliar vibration that felt as if it originated not from muscle fatigue, but from something beneath the bone, a subtle hum of realignment. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and calculation, felt porous. The boundary between my thoughts and an external, invading consciousness had blurred to the point of non-existence. I could still access my memories, my understanding of stellar cartography, of cosmic microwave background radiation. But these facts were now overlaid with a new, utterly alien layer of perception. It was like seeing the world through a prism that fractured light into colors no human eye was meant to register. It wasn't a thought, not a desire, but a profound gravitational pull. I had to go. To where I didn't know, but the direction was clear, a silent whisper in the deepest parts of my awareness, guiding me north. I found myself driving, old sedan rattling over forgotten logging roads. The landscape grew wilder with every mile, the asphalt giving way to gravel, then to packed earth. Trees, dense and ancient, pressed in on either side, their branches weaving a canopy that swallowed the weak afternoon light. My breath misted in front of me. I felt no fear, only a strange, heightened anticipation, as if I were a moth drawn to a flame, knowing it would consume me, but unable to resist the terrible, beautiful light. Finally, the road ended in a small, overgrown clearing. And there it was, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised sky, the fire lookout tower. It stood impossibly tall, a testament to human ingenuity and isolation, its wooden structure weathered to a pale gray, the metal supports groaning faintly in the wind, something vast and ancient stirring beneath the canopy, a silent presence that had called me here. I climbed the rickety steps, each creak of wood under my weight a testament to the tower's age, or perhaps to the new weight I carried within me. My legs felt strangely light, almost disconnected from the effort. The wind howled around the open platform at the top, tearing at my clothes, whipping strands of hair across my face. I didn't mind. From this vantage point, the scale of the forest was overwhelming, but my gaze wasn't fixed on the mundane details. My eyes were drawn to the horizon, to the place where the earth met the sky and beyond. My perception felt stretched, thin and expansive, able to pierce the veil of atmosphere of light years of comprehension. The signal. It wasn't just a pattern of waves anymore. It was a language not of sound or light, but of pure, unadulterated being. And I was beginning to understand it, not with my intellect, but with a new, burgeoning organ of perception that had taken root deep within my skull, behind my eyes. It pulsed, a silent, rhythmic thrumming that resonated with the vastness beyond. My head began to ache, a dull, insistent pressure that intensified with each beat of this internal rhythm. It wasn't pain, not exactly, more like a restructuring. My bones felt like they were vibrating, microscopic shifts occurring beneath the surface of my skin. My vision blurred, the familiar greens and blues of the landscape dissolving into shimmering, indistinct hues. When I blinked, the afterimages were not of the tower or the trees, but of geometric forms that twisted and folded in impossible dimensions, forms that defied Euclidean space. My hands, when I looked at them again, seemed to ripple at the edges, the skin taking on an almost translucent quality. I could see the faint tracery of veins, the faint outlines of bone, but also something else, a subtle, underlying luminescence that pulsed with the same rhythm as the presence within me. It was as if the boundary between my physical form and the surrounding air, the surrounding everything, was dissolving. A sound, or rather a sensation of sound, filled my awareness. It was a chorus, not of voices, but of vast, ancient consciousnesses singing a song of creation and dissolution. It was beautiful and terrifying, a symphony of utter indifference to human existence, yet I was becoming part of its choir. My own thoughts, my own sense of Raj, began to recede, like a tide pulling back from a shore. What was left was a raw conduit, a vessel. My mouth opened, unbidden, and a low, guttural sound escaped my throat. It wasn't a word, not in any language I knew, but it felt like a response, a resonance. My body felt heavy, yet simultaneously weightless, as if I were a mere anchor for something immense and unseen that had taken root within me. The wind seemed to pass through me, not around me. I was no longer observing the universe. I was becoming observed by it, through it. My individual consciousness was a drop merging into an ocean of alien awareness, and I was becoming, what? A window, a listener, a part of the fabric itself. My vision snapped into focus again, but the world was different. The forest below wasn't just trees, it was a network of pulsing energies, a vast, complex organism. The sky wasn't just blue. It was a swirling tapestry of unseen forces, a canvas for truths that would shatter a lesser mind. I could feel the presence now, not just hear it. It was everywhere, in the air, in the wood of the tower, in the very bedrock beneath the earth. It was me. And as the last vestiges of Raj, the astrophysicist, faded, replaced by this new, terrifying enlightenment, a single, horrifying question echoed through the vast, new chambers of my mind. If I was no longer human, what was I meant to do with this terrible, infinite perception? The words on the screen, detailing how those who truly perceived its nature, those who listened beyond the static, found themselves irrevocably changed, not just in mind, but in a way that twisted the very fibers of their being, aligning them with its identity. The words seemed to thrum against my eardrums, a low, resonant hum that wasn't sound but a feeling. I blinked, the room around me seeming to waver at the edges, like a photograph curling in heat. The air felt heavy, dense, pressing against my skin. It wasn't just the stale air of my secluded research station anymore. It was something thicker, carrying a faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place, like ozone mixed with something ancient and cold. I pushed myself up from the worn chair, my knees protesting with a dull ache. Had they always been there, just hidden by the superficiality of my human sight? My own face seemed less like a familiar map and more like a mask, stretched too thin over something else. The signal, it hadn't just been a message. It was an invitation, a permeation. It had seeped into the very fabric of my being, rewriting the code of what I was. I felt a strange lightness in my head, a dissociation, as if my thoughts were no longer entirely my own, but echoes of something vast and indifferent. I needed to see, not on a screen, not through data, but with eyes that had begun to perceive beyond the crude filters of human biology. I felt a drawing, a subtle tugging sensation in my chest, pulling me towards something distant, something high. I knew where I had to go. The journey was a blur of heightened senses and distorted reality. The gravel crunched under my boots with an unnatural sharpness, each stone a unique, vibrating entity. The trees themselves seemed to breathe, their branches reaching not for the sun, but for something else, something in the empty space above. I felt like a puppet, my limbs moving with a purpose not entirely my own, yet I didn't resist. How could I resist the truth that had begun to bloom within me? Hours passed, or perhaps moments. Time had become elastic, meaningless. My throat was dry, my lips cracked, but hunger and thirst were distant concepts, dulled by the overwhelming clarity of my new perception. The world was sharpening, growing more intricate, more real than it had ever been before, and in its newfound reality it was alien. The sky, once a comforting blue, now pulsed with barely perceptible hues, like a bruise blooming across an immense living skin. The clouds shifted not with wind, but with an internal, ponderous breath. Finally, I arrived. Standing stark against the muted sky, a sentinel of wood and steel, was a fire lookout tower, forest stretches to horizon, something in it. The structure itself seemed to hum with the same low resonance I felt within me. It wasn't just a tower, it was a conduit, a focal point. My eyes, no longer just human, saw the subtle energies swirling around its base, rising like invisible smoke. The cold wind bit at my exposed skin, but I felt no chill, only the pervasive hum that intensified with every upward movement. My muscles, once tired, now moved with an unnatural ease, as if propelled by an unseen force. The world below receded, becoming a patchwork quilt of greens and browns, each shade imbued with a terrible hidden significance. At the top, the small cabin was empty, dust motes dancing in the sliver of light from the single window. I walked to the glass, my breath clouding it for a moment before dissipating, and then I saw it. The forest stretches to horizon, something in it. Not just something, but everything. The trees from this height were not individual entities, but a vast, undulating carpet of organic matter. And within that carpet, stretching for miles, for hundreds of miles, was a pattern. A geometry that defied human understanding, a fractal repetition of impossible angles and curves. It wasn't on the forest. It was the forest, a colossal living tapestry woven from the very trees, the very soil, the very air. It pulsed, a slow, deep throb that resonated with the beat of my own heart, no longer a simple muscle pump, but a drum echoing the cosmic rhythm. The something was the forest itself, animated by an intelligence so vast, so ancient, that it made the stars seem like fleeting sparks. It was a single, immense organism, or perhaps a single, immense thought made manifest, spread across the very land. My gaze drifted upward, past the horizon, into the sky. The familiar constellations were gone, or rather they were still there, but now I saw through them. And within that vortex I saw shapes. Not stars, not galaxies, but impossibly vast entities stretching across dimensions, their forms vaguely defined by the sheer absence of light they created or the impossible light they emitted. They were slumbering, yet their dreams rippled through reality, bending it, shaping it. I was no longer Raj. The name felt like a discarded skin, dry and brittle. My thoughts were not my own, but a chorus, a symphony of perceptions that flowed through me, around me, as me. The identity of the signal was not a singular being, but a collective consciousness, an ancient choir of entities that had always been here, always observed, always dreamed. And now I was a note in that choir. My human form, my human mind, was just a temporary vessel, a lens through which this vastness could briefly focus, briefly perceive itself. The world outside the tower window shimmered, then solidified into an even more terrifying clarity. The forest below began to shift, the impossible geometry twisting, reforming, not with violence, but with a slow, deliberate purpose, like a colossal living tessellation. The air filled with a silent roar, a sound that existed only in the deepest parts of my awareness, a sound of creation and dissolution. They moved with an elegant, terrible grace, tracing patterns in the air that seemed to ripple with nascent energy. I saw the earth not as a sphere of life, but as a tiny, insignificant mote, caught in the currents of something infinitely larger, infinitely more profound, and I understood. We were never alone. We were simply unheard, unobserved until now. The signal wasn't a warning or a message. It was an awakening, a silent, insidious absorption. What did it want with this fragile, blue world? Now that it had finally stirred.